The ballroom smelled like candle wax and champagne, and Owen Brooks stood at the edge of it in a suit he hadn't worn since he buried his wife, watching his 6-year-old daughter's hand slip out of his. 1 second Harper was beside him, tugging at the hem of his jacket and asking if the little lights on the ceiling were real stars, and the next second she was gone, swallowed into a forest of long dresses and dark suits, and Owen's stomach dropped the way it always did now, the way it had dropped every day since Marissa died. That reflexive certainty that the worst thing was always one unguarded second away. He was halfway through the crowd, murmuring apologies, when he saw her, small, blonde, in the green dress Marissa had picked out for her last birthday, standing very still at the dessert table, staring up at a woman in a navy gown who had crouched down to Harper's exact height. Was Claire Whitfield, the CEO, the woman whose name was on the letterhead of every memo Owen had ever filed as the building's maintenance supervisor, the woman he had spoken to exactly twice in 4 years, both times about a broken elevator. She was holding a cupcake out to Harper like it was a decision of enormous consequence, tilting her head, listening to whatever 6-year-old logic Harper was explaining with her hands. And then, as Owen closed the last few feet between them, a man in a gray suit clapped him on the shoulder, beaming, gesturing at the three of them like a photographer arranging a family portrait, and said warmly, to no one in particular, "Look at that. Claire, I didn't know you two had a little one. She's gorgeous." A woman next to him laughed and agreed, already reaching for her phone, as if to take a picture of the moment, and for one suspended second, nobody moved. Harper's cupcake tilted dangerously in her small hand. Owen opened his mouth to correct them, the words already forming. "She's not, we're not." But Claire Whitfield, CEO of a company worth 9 figures, a woman who did not make mistakes in front of a room full of donors, simply smiled, straightened Harper's hair ribbon with 2 fingers, and changed the subject entirely, asking the man about his wife's health instead. She said nothing to correct them, nothing at all. To find out why and what it would come to mean for both of them, stay until the very end. If these overlooked, ordinary moments that quietly become everything speak to you, you're not alone. A lot of us have lived some version of this story, and it means something to have you watching it with us tonight. 6 months earlier, none of this existed. 6 months earlier, Owen Brooks was a name on a badge that nobody at Whitfield Dynamics looked at twice. A man who fixed the HVAC on the 14th floor and replaced flickering bulbs in the parking garage, and said almost nothing to anyone, because there was almost nothing left in him that wanted to be said out loud. He had been the building's maintenance supervisor for going on 4 years, ever since Marissa's diagnosis had made him choose a job with steady hours and health insurance over the contracting work he used to do, and ever since her death 18 months ago, he had narrowed his whole life down to 2 coordinates, dropping Harper at kindergarten and picking her up. Everything else was scaffolding around those 2 points. He ate the same lunch every day, sitting alone in the stairwell because the break room was too loud. He kept a photo of Marissa in his wallet, not out on display, just there, close, the way some people keep a spare key. Harper, for her part, had inherited her mother's habit of narrating the world out loud, chattering to Owen on the drive home about which of her stuffed animals had feelings that day. And Owen had learned to listen with his whole body, even when his mind was somewhere darker, because it was the only thing he had left to give her that didn't cost money he didn't have. He had not planned on ever setting foot in the Whitfield Dynamics ballroom, the annual charity gala 6 floors up from the boiler room he serviced twice a week, was for the executives, the board, the donors, not for the man who kept their elevators running. But Harper had come home from a school trip to see where Daddy works, had seen the building's lobby with its marble floors and its Christmas lights already going up for the winter fundraiser, and had asked, with the particular gravity only a 6-year-old can summon, if she could go to the party too, just once, just to see it. Owen had said no 4 times. He said yes the 5th time, mostly because he could not find another no left in him, and partly because Marissa used to say that Harper deserved to see beautiful things, even when their life didn't feel beautiful. And some nights that sentence was the only thing steering him at all. Claire Whitfield, meanwhile, had built Whitfield Dynamics from a company her father had nearly run into the ground into the fastest-growing logistics and infrastructure firm on the East Coast, a fact the business press liked to repeat as though it explained her, when really it explained almost nothing at all. She was 38, unmarried, and had not taken a vacation longer than 4 days in over a decade. The gala that night carried more weight than any of the smiling donors in the room understood. Whitfield Dynamics was 6 weeks from finalizing a merger that would either secure the company's next 20 years or quietly bleed it dry through debt the board had approved against Claire's own hesitation, and she had spent the better part of the evening moving from conversation to conversation with the specific, practiced warmth of someone keeping 100 small fires from spreading. She had noticed the little girl in the green dress, the way she noted most things in a room full of people not looking closely enough. A small figure standing very still near the dessert table, clearly separated from whoever she belonged to, chewing on the edge of her own sleeve in a way that read, to Claire, less like mischief and more like quiet worry trying to keep itself contained. Claire had crossed the room without deciding to. She would think about that later. The fact that her feet had simply moved, faster than her calendar brain could object, and she would trace it back, though not that night, to a version of herself at roughly the same age, standing at the edge of a different room, waiting for a father who was never coming back to the table. When Claire crouched down in front of Harper, the first thing she asked was not "Where's your mommy?" or "Where's your daddy?" the questions that would have required Harper to explain the hardest fact of her short life to a stranger in a beautiful dress. Instead, Claire asked which cupcake looked the most like it was having a bad day, and Harper, delighted, pointed immediately to a lopsided one with too much frosting on one side, and the two of them had a brief, entirely serious negotiation about whether a sad cupcake deserved to be eaten first out of kindness or last out of respect. It was during this negotiation that Owen finally reached them, breathless, already saying her name, "Harper, Harper, hey," with the particular edge in his voice that only another parent, or someone who remembered being frightened for someone small, would recognize as relief wearing the costume of mild frustration. Claire looked up at him, and for just a moment before either of them said anything, there was a small, unguarded flicker of recognition on her face. Not because she knew him, but because she recognized the exact shape of what she was looking at. A man doing the whole enormous work of being both parents at once, alone, in a room built for people who had never had to. She stood, smoothed her dress, and handed Harper the lopsided cupcake with a small ceremonial nod, as if crowning her. It was in that exact moment, with Harper's hand slipping trustingly into Claire's on one side while Owen reached for her other hand, that the man in the gray suit made his happy, careless assumption, and the whole room, for one photograph-shaped second, agreed with him. 8 weeks would pass before Owen understood that the woman who said nothing that night had spent every one of those weeks, quietly, deliberately, making sure their paths would cross again. The 2 weeks after the gala were, for Owen, an exercise in trying to forget an evening he could not stop replaying. He told himself it meant nothing, that Claire Whitfield had been kind to a lonely little girl, the way any decent person would be kind to a lonely little girl, that her silence in the face of the gray-suited man's mistake had been nothing more than a busy executive declining to waste breath on a correction that didn't matter to her, and that he had absolutely no business thinking about the particular, steady way she had looked at him afterward, as though she were doing quiet arithmetic behind her eyes. He went back to the boiler room. He went back to the stairwell lunches. He told himself the story was over. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that on the Monday after the gala, Claire had asked her assistant, almost offhandedly, to pull the personnel file of the maintenance supervisor who'd been at the party with his daughter, and that her assistant, a sharp, watchful woman named Renata, who had worked for Claire for 6 years and had learned to read the difference between her boss's idle curiosity and her real attention, had noticed that Claire read the file twice. The humiliation, when it came, arrived from an entirely different direction, and it arrived in front of everyone. Whitfield Dynamics was hosting a facilities walkthrough for the board ahead of the merger vote. Donors and directors touring the building to be reassured that the company they were investing further millions into was, in every physical sense, sound, and Owen had been asked, 2 days prior, to make sure the 14th floor server room's cooling system was running at full capacity, since a section of the tour would pass directly by its viewing window. He had flagged, in writing, in an email sent to the facilities director 11 days earlier, that the cooling unit's secondary compressor was failing and needed replacement, not patching, and that running the primary unit alone through a warm week without a backup was a real risk. The facilities director, a man named Gerald Voss, who had never once in 4 years learned Owen's last name and referred to him only as Maintenance, had not read the email, or had read it and dismissed it, and had told Owen the morning of the walkthrough, in front of 2 junior staff, that the fix Owen had proposed was an unnecessary expense, and that he should simply keep it running for the tour. 2 hours later, in the middle of the walkthrough, with 11 board members and Claire Whitfield herself standing at the viewing window, the primary compressor overheated and the server room's temperature alarm went off. A shrill, humiliating sound that echoed down the marble hallway while red warning lights washed over the glass. Gerald Voss, cornered and panicking in front of the very people whose money kept his department funded, did not hesitate. He turned to the small crowd, found Owen standing nearby with his toolkit, already moving toward the panel to shut down and reroute the system before real damage was done, and said, loudly enough for the whole hallway to hear, that this was exactly the kind of oversight he'd been trying to correct in maintenance for months, that he'd told this employee twice to stay on top of preventive checks, and that clearly the message hadn't landed. Owen said nothing. This was by now a practiced kind of silence, the same silence he'd carried through Marissa's last months in the hospital, when doctors said things that weren't fair, and he'd had no energy left to argue with fairness, only to keep showing up. He fixed the compressor manually within 4 minutes, rerouting cooling from a secondary system he'd installed himself 18 months earlier, without anyone approving the budget for it, quietly, the way he did most things that mattered. The alarm stopped, the tour resumed, nobody thanked him. 3 days later, Gerald Voss called Owen into his office and told him, in the flat procedural language of someone protecting himself rather than explaining anything, that given the incident with the board and an ongoing need to restructure the maintenance budget, his position was being eliminated, effective in 2 weeks, though he'd be welcome to apply for a reduced part-time contractor role if one opened up in the spring. There was no mention of the email. There was no mention of the 4 minutes it had taken Owen to fix what Voss's negligence had caused. Owen did not argue. He asked only one question, whether his health insurance would run through the end of the month, because Harper had a dentist appointment on the 28th, and when Voss said it would not, Owen simply nodded, thanked him for the opportunity of the last 4 years, and walked back down to the boiler room to finish his shift, because the elevators still needed servicing and somebody still had to do it. He told Harper that night that he'd gotten a different job, a better one, closer to home, and she believed him the way 6-year-olds believe most things their fathers tell them, completely and without follow-up questions. And Owen lay awake afterward, doing the math on their savings, and coming up short in a way that felt less like panic and more like the slow, familiar tightening of a room he already knew the size of. He did not know, could not have known, that 2 floors above his old boiler room, Claire Whitfield had asked Renata, almost as an afterthought during a budget review a week later, whatever had happened to the maintenance supervisor from the gala, the one whose daughter had picked the lopsided cupcake, and that Renata, checking, had come back with a short, uncomfortable answer. He'd been let go, officially for a cooling failure during the board walkthrough, though the paper trail, when she pulled it, told a very different story than the one Gerald Voss had given upstairs. If you've ever done everything right and still been the one blamed when someone else's carelessness caught up with everyone, you already know exactly what that hallway sounded like to Owen, and you're not the only one who's carried a silence like his home at the end of a hard day. 4 months would pass, quiet and uneventful on the surface, before that particular silence finally cracked open. Claire Whitfield did not, as a rule, revisit decisions that weren't hers to begin with. She had a company to run and a merger still tightening around her like a wire, the kind of deal that required her full, undivided attention through every late-night call with lawyers and every tense conversation with a board that increasingly seemed to be making decisions 3 steps ahead of her, rather than beside her. But something about the maintenance supervisor's dismissal had lodged itself sideways in her mind, and refused to sit still, The way a small inconsistency will sometimes bother a person far more than a large one, precisely because it seems like it should be simple to resolve and isn't. She kept thinking of the cupcake negotiation, the quiet, careful way Harper's father had reached for his daughter's hand. Not grabbing, just offering it. Patient, in a way that had nothing performative in it, because there had been no one there to perform for, except a little girl who trusted him completely. And she kept thinking, too, of something closer to home, something she rarely let herself think about during business hours. Her own father, a man who had died when she was 7, leaving behind a half-finished company and a house that felt, for years afterward, like it was holding its breath. She did not remember much about him with clarity anymore, but she remembered exactly what it felt like to be a small girl in a room full of adults who were too busy or too grieving to crouch down to her height. And she remembered, with more precision than she liked, the 1 or 2 people who had, and how disproportionately large that kindness had felt against the size of everything else that was going wrong. It was Renata who finally brought her the file that made the inconsistency impossible to ignore. Renata had pulled the full facility's email chain, not out of any particular suspicion at first, simply because Claire had asked her to close the loop on where the former maintenance supervisor had landed, in case a reference call ever came through. What she found instead was an email sent 11 days before the board walkthrough, laying out in plain, specific technical language exactly what would happen to the 14th floor cooling system if the secondary compressor wasn't replaced before a warm week. An email that predicted, almost to the letter, the failure that had happened in front of the entire board, and an email that Gerald Voss had never once mentioned in his account of the incident. Renata brought it to Claire without editorializing, simply set it on her desk, and said that she thought Claire should see it before the department budget meeting that afternoon, and left the room. Claire read it twice, the way she'd read Owen's personnel file twice weeks earlier, and felt something colder and more specific than curiosity settle into her chest. The particular anger of realizing that a decision she'd trusted someone else to make correctly had in fact been made carelessly, and that the person who paid for that carelessness had been the one person in the building who'd tried to prevent it. She did not act immediately, and this too was its own kind of crisis, because the merger vote was now less than 3 weeks away, and a member of the board, a man named Harold Pruitt, old money, old grudges, who had never fully forgiven Claire's father for a business dispute 2 decades earlier, and had spent years looking for reasons to suggest Claire wasn't seasoned enough to run the company alone, begun quietly circulating the idea that Whitfield Dynamics needed additional oversight structures ahead of the merger, oversight that would, not coincidentally, dilute Claire's authority over her own company at the exact moment she needed it most. Confronting Voss publicly now, reopening a personnel decision that had already been closed, would hand Pruitt exactly the narrative he wanted. A CEO who couldn't manage her own staff, who let sentiment override procedure. Claire understood the calculation perfectly and hated it anyway. She spent 3 days turning it over, and on the 4th day she did the only thing that felt honest to her, which was to find Owen Brooks in person rather than send a lawyer or an HR representative in her place. She found him through Renata's careful, discreet inquiry, working part-time at a small contracting firm 2 towns over, doing exactly the kind of skilled mechanical work he'd been quietly overqualified for the entire time he'd been fixing elevators at Whitfield Dynamics. She drove there herself, without an assistant, without a driver, in jeans instead of a suit, and found him in the parking lot at the end of a shift, wiping his hands on a rag, visibly startled to see her standing there. Their conversation was awkward in the specific way 2 people talk when neither of them has decided yet how honest to be. Claire offered, first, what she assumed he'd want, his old position back, immediately, with a formal apology and a settlement to cover the 2 months of lost income and benefits. Owen, to her genuine surprise, said no. Not out of pride, he clarified, watching her carefully, but because going back to being invisible in that building, fixing what nobody thanked him for fixing, wasn't actually what he wanted, and money wasn't going to undo the fact that Voss had lied to a room full of powerful people, without a second thought about what it would cost a man with a 6-year-old daughter and a mortgage. What he wanted instead, he said slowly, like he was surprised to be saying it out loud, was simpler and harder to give. He wanted it to be true, officially and on paper, that he hadn't been the one who failed. He wanted the record corrected, not for revenge, but so that the next person in his position, someone without savings, to fall back on, someone with less patience than he'd learned the hard way to have, wouldn't be thrown away as easily as he had been. Claire stood in that parking lot longer than she meant to, turning that over, understanding for the first time that this wasn't going to be resolved with a check. It was on her drive back into the city that afternoon, replaying the conversation, that Claire got the call from Renata that the merger's outside auditors had flagged an irregularity in the facility's budget going back nearly 2 years, an irregularity that traced, when the numbers were finally laid out in full, directly back to Gerald Voss quietly padding maintenance contracts to a vendor he had an undisclosed personal relationship with, the very same vendor he'd claimed, in that hallway with the alarms blaring, would have been the unnecessary expense of replacing the failing compressor properly. The board would need those numbers explained within 2 weeks, before the merger vote, and Claire understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the story she'd thought was about one man's careless decision was actually about to unravel into something much larger, and much harder to keep quiet. The 2 weeks that followed moved faster than anything Claire had navigated since taking over the company, and for the first time in a long while, she found herself grateful for a version of pressure that at least had a clear moral shape to it. She brought in an independent auditor from outside the company, someone with no history with Voss or with Pruitt's faction on the board, and asked them to trace the maintenance budget irregularities back to their origin, without telling them what she suspected they'd find, because she wanted the numbers to speak first, and her judgment to follow, not the other way around. What emerged over those 2 weeks was precise and damning in exactly the way Owen's original email had been precise and prescient. Nearly 11 months of inflated contracts routed to a single vendor, a vendor whose ownership records, once pulled, listed Gerald Voss's brother-in-law as a managing partner, and a pattern of exactly the kind of unnecessary expense language Voss had used to shut down Owen's compressor request, used again and again to justify cutting corners on real maintenance, while approving inflated invoices for cosmetic work nobody had asked for. Claire read the full report twice in her office at 11 at night, alone, and felt the particular, quiet fury of watching a small injustice reveal itself to be part of a much larger one. She called Owen, before she called anyone else, before HR, before legal, before even Renata knew she was making the call. She told him what the audit had found, laid it out plainly, technically, the way she suspected he'd want it laid out rather than softened, and asked him, not as a formality this time, but because she genuinely needed it, whether he'd be willing to walk the auditor and the board's compliance committee through the original cooling system failure himself, in detail, so there would be no ambiguity left in the record about what had actually happened that day. Owen agreed, on one condition: that Harper's dentist appointment, the one he'd lied to her about the reason for missing, would not come up, would not become part of the story the board heard, because whatever restoration happened here, it wasn't going to happen by turning his daughter into a detail in someone else's guilt. Claire agreed without hesitation, and something in the ease of that agreement, the fact that she understood instinctively what needed protecting and what didn't, settled a question Owen hadn't realized he'd still been asking himself about her. The compliance committee meeting, 3 days before the merger vote, was not a public spectacle, but it might as well have been, given who sat around the table. The full board, Harold Pruitt among them, the outside auditor, Claire, and Gerald Voss, who had been asked to attend without being told exactly why, and who arrived visibly rattled the moment he saw Owen seated quietly at the far end of the table, with a folder of his own. Owen spoke for perhaps 12 minutes total, and he did it the way he did everything, without raising his voice, without a single unnecessary word, laying out the original compressor failure risk, the email he'd sent 11 days before the walkthrough, the 4 minutes it had taken him to reroute cooling through a secondary system he'd installed on his own initiative 18 months earlier, because he hadn't trusted the primary system's age, and the conversation in which Voss had told him, in front of 2 witnesses, to simply keep it running. He did not accuse Voss of anything beyond what the record already showed. He didn't have to. Voss, watching the board's faces shift from polite attention to something colder, made the mistake every cornered person in this kind of room eventually makes. He began improvising, contradicting his own earlier statements about the timeline, insisting he'd never received an email he had, in fact, replied to 11 days prior, a reply that the auditor then read aloud from the very inbox. Voss had assumed no one would check that carefully. By the time the meeting ended, the board had voted unanimously to place Voss on immediate leave pending termination, and Harold Pruitt, who had spent weeks quietly building a case that Claire lacked the seasoning to run her own company, found himself in the uncomfortable position of having just watched her run an internal investigation with more precision and fairness than his own preferred candidates for additional oversight had ever managed. What Owen hadn't expected, walking out of that room, was Claire following him into the hallway, out of earshot of the board, still visibly holding the tension of the last 2 weeks in her shoulders. She thanked him, plainly, and then, in a way that surprised them both, she told him something she hadn't planned to say out loud, that watching him refuse a payout in that parking lot, choosing to ask for the truth instead of the money, had reminded her of something about her own father she'd spent 30 years trying not to think about. That the year before he died, his own business partner had quietly frozen him out of decisions he'd built the company around, and that her father, sick and running out of time, had never once fought publicly to reclaim credit for what he'd started, choosing instead to spend his remaining months teaching a 7-year-old Claire how to read a balance sheet at the kitchen table, as if that was the inheritance that actually mattered. She said she'd spent her whole career terrified of ending up quietly erased the way he had, and that some version of that fear was exactly why she hadn't corrected the man in the gray suit at the gala. Not because she'd wanted to lie about who Owen was to her, but because for one strange, unguarded evening, being mistaken for someone's family, someone's person, had felt like something she hadn't let herself want in years. Owen didn't say anything for a long moment, standing in that marble hallway in his work jacket, and then he said, quietly, that he hadn't corrected it either, not really. Not in the way he could have. He'd only said the polite thing out loud while some other part of him had gone very still and very quiet, the way it hadn't gone still in a long time. Neither of them moved to fix that sentence. 3 weeks would pass, filled with merger paperwork, and a formal public correction of Owen's employment record, before either of them found the nerve to say anything else that honest out loud again. The merger closed on schedule, and it closed clean, with Whitfield Dynamics emerging from the process not weakened but strengthened, its board more unified around Claire than it had been in years. Harold Pruitt's oversight proposal quietly withdrawn. Once it became clear, the story the press would tell was one of a CEO who'd caught internal corruption before it could compromise a 9-figure deal, not one who needed managing. Gerald Voss's termination was finalized without fanfare, the vendor contracts were unwound, and the 14th floor cooling system was replaced properly, fully, with a line item in the budget that Claire personally approved and that carried, buried in its internal documentation, where only a handful of people would ever see it, a formal, permanent correction to Owen Brooks's employment record, stating plainly that his original assessment had been correct and that his actions during the equipment failure had prevented significant damage to company infrastructure. When Claire offered him, in a private meeting a week later, a formal position, Director of Facilities Operations, a real title, a real salary, a corner office 2 floors up from the boiler room he used to service, Owen thought about it for exactly as long as it took to picture what that office would actually mean for his life. More hours away from Harper, a return to a building full of people who'd only just learned his last name, a title that would fix nothing about the years he'd spent unseen. He declined, gently, and asked instead for something smaller and, to Claire, far more surprising, a standing seat on the Facilities and Safety Review Board, unpaid extra beyond his existing consulting hours, so that no maintenance concern flagged by someone without a title would ever again be dismissed by a single manager without independent review. Claire approved it within the hour, and had it written into company policy before the quarter was out. not as a favor to Owen, but because she'd come, in the space of 2 months, to genuinely believe it was the right way to run the company her father had started. The quiet coda came 3 months later, on an ordinary Saturday morning, not at a gala, not in a boardroom, but at a small park near Owen's house, where Claire had come, at Harper's specific and repeated invitation, to see the treehouse Owen had spent the last few weekends building in the backyard of the small rental house he and Harper had just moved into. Bigger than the last one, with a real second bedroom, paid for partly by the consulting contract Claire's company now retained him under. Harper gave Claire the full, elaborate tour, narrating each plank of wood with the same seriousness she'd once applied to lopsided cupcakes. And Claire, sitting afterward on the back porch steps beside Owen while Harper climbed the ladder for the 4th time, turned the small wooden bead bracelet Harper had made her, a birthday party craft project Harper insisted every important person needed, over in her fingers, and said quietly that she'd spent so many years believing worth was something you proved in a boardroom, in front of the right people, at the right volume, and that it had taken a 6-year-old and a lopsided cupcake to teach her otherwise. Owen, watching his daughter climb, said that he'd spent those same years believing the opposite, that if he just stayed quiet enough, careful enough, nothing more could be taken from him, and that it had taken a woman who didn't correct a room full of strangers to teach him that some things were worth risking out loud. If you've ever been the person written off in a hallway, misjudged before anyone bothered to look closer, or if you've ever quietly stayed silent to protect someone smaller than you, this story was for you. And if there's someone in your own life who was underestimated the way Owen was, a parent, a coworker, someone who did the hard, invisible work and never got the credit, we'd love to hear about them in the comments. Even if all you do is finally say their name and give them the credit they were owed. If stories about quiet, overlooked people finally being truly seen mean something to you, consider staying with us. There are more of these stories to come, and we're glad to have you here for them.